Our speaker is Peter O'Leary, who teaches at both the School of the Art Institute at Chicago and here at the University of Chicago. Professor O'Leary is the author of several books of poetry, most recently The Sampo, a book-length fantasy poem set in the far north featuring a wizard, a sorceress, a sword, and a mysterious magical object of absorbing perfection. And he's also written a new book of criticism, Thick and Dazzling Darkness, Religious Poetry in a Secular Age. Both of these books are available for sale out in the hall. Tonight's lecture is also entitled Thick and Dazzling Darkness, so I imagine, like the book, it will be about the existence and importance of religious poetry in 20th and 21st century American literature. Perhaps it'll help us to think about questions like how do poets use language to render the transcendent, often dizzyingly inexpressible nature of the divine? In an age of secularism, does spirituality have a place in modern American poetry? These are both questions that the dust jacket informs me this book is about. I'm excited to hear more, and I hope that you are also. So please help me to welcome Professor Peter O'Leary.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Thanks as well to Thomas and Mark and everybody at Lumen Christi for inviting me to come talk to you this afternoon. I'm really happy to be here, not least because it's a little bit of a homecoming for me. This is where I went to graduate school, and I feel like I hope the ideas that I'm going to talk about with you maybe took shape many years ago while I was here. Provide an example of how to move forward with some of those ideas. Perhaps. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is just provide a brief little orientation into the book, Thick and Dazzling Darkness, and then an anthology of 4 of the poets that I talk about in the book. I'll give some context and read some examples, read some samples of their poems for kicks. So it'll give you a good sense of what the book is like. It is, it's an academic book in that it was published by an academic publisher, but my critical style is, I'd like to think, very personable. Similar to this jacket, perhaps. Like, think of it that way. Formal, but, look at that. That's not bad. That was for my friend Victoria. And I can begin now that Jeremy Biles is here. So we're good. So here's the description in the authorized version of God's appearance on Mount Sinai in Exodus 20:21. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. These words arrive moments after Moses has first heard God utter the 10 Commandments to him. Richard Elliott Friedman, in his commentary on the Torah, translates, and Moses went over to the nimbus where God was. Everett Fox, in his translation from the Hebrew, inspired by Martin Buber's and Franz Rosenzweig's German, renders it, and Moshe approached the fog where God was. Commenting, Arafel, frequently used in conjunction with anan, cloud. Darkness, nimbus, fog, cloud, a language of bewilderment, trouble. St. Jerome, in his Vulgate translation from the 4th century, rendered the word as kaliginum, from kaliga for darkness, gloom, and from kaligo to becloud, to darken, to make dizzy. In his epistles, Dionysius wrote, Divina kaligo lux est inaccessa quam inhabitare Deus perhibitur, which means the divine darkness is unapproachable light, in which God is said to dwell. In reference to this passage, alchemist Thomas Vaughan, in Lumen de Lumine, a work from 1651, comments, that which is above all degree of intelligence is a certain infinite, inaccessible fire or light. Dionysius calls it Caligo divina, because it is invisible and incomprehensible. Thomas's twin brother Henry, aspiring to the indefinite, puts it more directly himself in The Night. There is in God, some say, a deep but dazzling darkness, as men here say it is late and dusky, because they see not all clear. Oh, for that night, where I in him might live invisible and dim. Imagine Moses then, in the act of giving the law to Israel. The Israelites are terrified. Seismic upheavals have anticipated God's commandments. Their souls are quaking. And all the people saw thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. In a fright, the people ask Moses to speak on their behalf, not wanting to confront this potent divinity themselves. Telling them not to be afraid, he suddenly steps into the dizzying, thick darkness, where the Lord speaks to his prophet, instructing him to erect an altar whereon Moses and his kind will make sacrifices, for which God promises to bless them forever after. Moses' contact with God in this moment stands for the symbolic acts of the religious poet, though the atmosphere is gloomy and ominous and the location strenuous to get to. The divine is present, and there is the prospect of law, covenant, revelation, and genuine power. Thick and Dazzling Darkness is a book about the role religion and a religious worldview play in the work of a handful of modern and contemporary poets working in North America. It's also about writing and reading religious poetry in a secular age. It's commonplace to hear that we live in a secular age, but what does this really mean? More to the point, what does it mean for the poets who are the subject of the book? These poets are Frank Samperi, Robinson Jeffers, Jeffrey Hill, Robert Duncan, Lissa Wolzak, Fanny Howe, Nathaniel Mackey, Joseph Donahue, and Pam Reem. So what does it mean for them to write religious poetry, which is to say, to choose to write religious poetry in a secular culture in which religion has ceased to carry the meaning, both cultural and literary, that it has in the past? So the purpose of this book is to discuss the role religion plays in the poetry these poets have written, and also to place their religious worldviews in context, one that includes both spiritual and literary historical meanings. So my title serves to prepare the way I'm imagining into this material. And those are the opening two paragraphs of the introduction. And they supply you with a sense of the book through the title, this metaphor of thick and dazzling darkness. So in combining Moses' experience of the thick darkness, in whose umbers the divine might be encountered, with Henry Vaughan's expression of the dazzling darkness whose brightness dims the light of one's life in comparison, I wanted to provide an archetype for the religious poet in a secular age. Like Moses approaching the burning bush, blinded by the unconsuming fire of the divine imagination, but also daunted and moved by the scintillating gloom surrounding. And also a language for the experience and its emanating meanings, a kind of tawil of the dark light of creation. In Avicenna and the Visionary Recital, Henry Corbin defines tawil, which is the Islamic practice of mystical or esoteric interpretation, as not only exegesis of a text, but exegesis of the soul. Elsewhere, Corbin indicates that the literal meaning of tawil is led back, which is to say, led back from outer meanings to inner regions corresponding to it. In this respect, perhaps, the archetype of Moses leads us back to the corresponding inner meanings of whatever a thick and dazzling darkness might be. So, rather than rehearse any more of my argument here, I'd like to provide an anthology of 4 of the poets I write about in Thick and Dazzling Darkness, 3 Catholics and 1 Protestant poet, to give you a sense of their lives and works and how the writing of religious poetry reinvigorates poetry in a secular age. While I cover several poets in the book, this anthology will focus on Frank Samperi, Fanny Howe, Joseph Donahue, and Pam Reem. And I'm going to quote from their poetry in what remains here, but brought a number of their books and put them on the table. So if you're curious afterwards and want to take a peep at some of those books, I encourage you to do so. So I'm going to address the poets in that order. So Frank Samperi belongs in the category of the overlooked talents of American poetry of the last 50 years. He wrote his best poetry in the 1960s and saw it published partially in the 1970s. By the end of the 70s, he had nearly entirely faded from the publishing scene, living in obscurity until his death in 1991. Born in Brooklyn in 1933, Samperi, an orphan and an autodidact, as a young man sought out Louis Zukofsky, the great second-generation modernist. Letters between them date back to the time Samperi was 24. The older poet mentored him, connecting Samperi eventually with Sid Corman, a legendary publisher of the second half of the 20th century, who became his champion and publisher in Origin. Samperi was a fixture of Origin's second series, presented with the likes of Zukofsky, Ian Hamilton Finlay, Gary Snyder, Lorene Niedeker, William Bronk, and of course Corman himself. These connections led to the publication of an untitled trilogy of books in the early 1970s by Grossman Mushinsha, comprised of the Prefiguration, Quadripherium, and Lumen Gloria. These books collected 18 pamphlets and small books Samperi had written in the late 1960s. The trilogy of books, designed and printed in Japan, it's strikingly beautiful, as you'll see if you're curious afterwards. Featuring rich and unusual stone prints by Will Peterson on the dust jacket, as well as oblong pages, making for one of the handsomest sets of books of American poetry from that period. I discovered the trilogy in the summer of 1996. I'd been primed by John Taggart's essay, A Spiritual Definition of Poetry, which I had read for the first time that spring. I'd never heard of Samperi before. Reading Taggart's essay, the samples of the poetry in the essay contained were alluring, to say the least. But it didn't prepare me for what awaited me when I found a paperback copy of Quadripherium in the book sale at a literature conference in Maine that June. The poetry in that book for me was transformative. I felt the hinge on a door long stuck shut, suddenly generously oiled. Here was work in the idiom of the new American poetry that was not only open to the spiritual, but explicitly religious in a way that spoke to another tradition with which I wrestled, namely Catholicism. The book quickly became a treasure, and in the days before internet book searches, I devoted myself to finding copies of the opening and closing volumes in the Tercet, the Prefiguration and Lumen Gloria, as quickly as I could, lucking into a copy of the first at a used bookstore in Chicago, but spending more money than I really had at the time for the other. No matter, says the bibliophile. The books were necessary to have and their value magnified in my possession. So I wouldn't call Frank Samperi a mystic, but he is a mystical poet, one who avails mystical techniques and language in his poetry. Mysticism does not define the limit of his poetry, but Samperi's raids on the articulate are visional, angeliphanic, to use one of Henry Corbin's favorite words, which he defines as divine anthropomorphos on the plane of the spiritual universe, the human form or divine humanity of the angelic world. Samperi is seeing things, putting them into words. Nevertheless, he might agree that mystical speech is subordinated to and ultimately unraveled by the divine. The poet fixes his eye on the unfixable, immutable, always hidden God beyond the Ptolemaic universe he imagines himself in and transmits the vision of the cosmos he gazes at in the words he has at hand. Language pales, but it also excites, uplifts. Samperi's is a poetry of spiritual recovery, not a formal creation, nor even of a participation with that creation. The unitive power he aspires to is above and beyond him, not something emanating from him or created by him. It is something he receives and reflects, and in reflection, something he gives. In his poetry, Samperi would restore us to the undivided, glorified body of God. So laid in Lumen Gloria, he writes, "Then the dwelling of the angel in the soul, or rather the odor, sign, of the dwelling, continuing, habituating the man to the daily, drawing out radiance, preparing, rendering, transparent, the surrounding, the universe, the aureole, receiving truest ray. To what is that provocative word odor attached in the lines above? To the angel? To the perfume of the indwelling of the angel in the soul? The word instantly locates the set of thoughts in the actual, habituating the man, receiving the truest ray, might serve as a motto for Sampere's poetic wish in his surroundings, in the universe, in the angelic aureole. Receptivity to the divine happens in the human sensorium, smell, sight, feeling. Quadripherium, that's the second volume in the trilogy, is a term drawn from a more peculiar source. It's a Latin adverb meaning fourfold, which Sampere uses to refer specifically to Dante's four-tiered interpretive approach to Scripture, which the poet himself drew from his readings of St. Aquinas and St. Augustine. In Dante's letter to his patron Congrande, he describes how Scripture can be understood polysemously on the literal, the allegorical, the moral or tropological, and the anagogical or mystical levels. Furthermore, in the same letter, Dante informs Congrande that his Commedia also operates using a threefold pattern in its form, from the three canticles of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso to the individual cantos in each part down to the rhymed musical tercets. In a note on the dust jacket to Quadripherium, it tells you something how obscure a poet is if you have to go to the notes on the dust jacket to find statements from the poet. And this, what I'm about to read you, is so obscure. Just wait. So in the note on the dust jacket to Quadripherium, Sampere mysteriously distills all this to say, the relationship bears a single experience, one of the intelligences, that is, at one end implied, the prefiguration, at the other established, Quadripherium. Therefore, the emotion companionship. However, Quadripherium carries with it the descent, book, canzone, song, that is, eternity, image, gift, which is to say that the collapse gets defined in a more detailed manner. That's him writing about his own poetry. That's insane. I'll just say that. So imagine then, placed atop the fourfold pattern of discernment, a triune pattern of poetic intention, which, when turned like a geometrically shaped dial, generates a kaleidoscope of patterns that becomes the work itself. I think that's what he's doing to get the poetry. By informing the melancholic actual of his observing eye with visional angelophony, Sampere in his poetry ascends a ladder he makes from it, beginning the climb to God on the long itinerarium that marks his work. The place where I see this happening most vividly is in one of the poems toward the end of the triune, the sequence that begins Quadripherium, the entirety of which I increasingly regard as the heart and soul of Sampere's accomplishment, and this poem in particular. You'll notice Sampere is a bit of a minimalist. He likes abstraction. So suspend yourself in the abstracted void for a moment here. Spirit, the spirit, and identification, water and image significantly subject. The revelation, the man. Resolution, the projection. The man, another, an extension, the one below. If point, no boundary. Then point, invalid. Metaphorical, the man, reference. The universe, creation. Eternity, image, use. Relational, fire. Plane, angel, visional, plane, other. Close, far, approximations. Speed, apperceptive. Rest, background, the relation. Circular, each to each, however differential, integral, appetitive, the noetic, self, return, pilgrimage, image, eternity. The beginning lines of the poem are incantational, building momentum through the Latinate words revelation, resolution, projection, extension. In this poem, man is the reference point, generically in the usage common to Samperi's time, but also specifically in terms of himself, the poet envisioning the spirit with whom he is identifying. The man reference the universe creation, sets up a typological comparison Samperi's verse thrives on. As man is the reference point, so the universe is the creative expansion, leading to three richly utile words in Samperi's lexicon: eternity, image, use. All three relational to the visional angel speeding apperceptively through the lines of the poem, which directs our attention to the simultaneous differential and integral unity of the divine reality the poem itself invokes. It ends with a beatific reversion to source, self, return, followed by an utterly characteristic Samperian line: pilgrimage, image, eternity. The image of eternity is pilgrimage. All beings, all life in the spirit strive toward integral, differential holiness. Just as the word pilgrimage, so Samperi makes us see, has an image in its heart. So that's Samperi. Fanny Howe. Fanny Howe was born in 1940 in Buffalo, New York, but grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the daughter of an Irish stage actress and a constitutional law professor. She grew up in a fertile artistic and intellectual environment. Her older sister is the poet Susan Howe, whose work some of you may know. Well, I know at least a few of you know. Looking out to the crowd. In the 1960s, Howe became involved with political activist and writer Carl Senna, whose father was Mexican and whose mother was African American. In the racially divisive atmosphere of Boston at the time, this was especially transgressive, and Howe soon found herself ostracized even from the liberal enclaves she had grown up in. Howe and Senna were drawn together because of shared creative, political, and philosophical interests. They married, and in quick succession, Howe gave birth to 3 children by him. Senna was Catholic. His mother was devout. She attended daily mass on her way to her job at the courthouse in downtown Boston. We had the children baptized, writes Howe, and I began attending mass with my mother-in-law, hovering at the back of the church and feeling myself excluded and estranged from the rituals. Nonetheless, Howe continued to attend mass and eventually, quoting her, grew increasingly comfortable sitting at mass and participating in everything but the Eucharist for many years. But even as she became more comfortable in the Mass, her life in Boston was fraught by racism toward her children and by the poverty that afflicted her, in part because the kind of activist life she and her husband were committed to, but also because she felt herself denied any opportunities by white-dominated Boston, since she was involved with a black man and her children were mixed race. Boston, she tells us, recalcitrant and class-divided, was a poor choice to live as a mixed couple. After her marriage to Senna dissolved, Howe found herself drawn increasingly to the church, in part because sitting in the pew at Mass she felt a sense of community she otherwise lacked. This included things like help with childcare among mothers in similar straits to her own. And before long, Howe converted. My sense is that her conversion concentrated her interests in misfortune, especially the plight of the misfortunate, and her work includes more tramps, a word she uses unironically, than any poet in English since Wordsworth. So many tramps in her work. So the misfortune is one of her interests, and the other is grace, the daunting mystery of God's love freely given. In one of her greatest sequences, entitled "In the Spirit There Are No Accidents," Howe writes, "God is already ahead and waiting. The future is full. One steps timidly over the world. The other is companionable. The house is there. The door is there. Others. But for you they make no sound when you're so far. I know the bench is by the pond tomorrow, when I can follow the streets to it by heart. Yes, streets. Yes, hearts. Night walk of faith. Chromosomes live in the past. The land is an incarnation, like a hand on an arm asking, do you know me? And here's another. Sister Poverty, welcome to my cloister. All that lowers must draw close. In the world of wretches and the exploited, of the accidentally destroyed, the strike of each heart in the distant body, ups the odds that there's a why, but why? To these, I'll add some samples from one of Howe's most important writings, in my opinion, a poem essay entitled Catholic. It's a poem in that most of it is written in verse, but it's an essay in that she published it not in a poetry collection, but in The Wedding Dress, which is a collection of her essays. Catholic is strung on tensions that characterize Howe's poetry, namely an existential flatness of affect that coalesces into aphoristic, lyrical statements often clothed in mystery. Yet the piece involves essayistic elements as well, in a way suggestively more confessional than her poetry ever really seems. The opening two sections are illustrative of these features, the aphoristic lyricism and the confessional quality, written during a period she was commuting every day from Los Angeles to La Jolla, where she was teaching, a time in which she has elsewhere described herself as miserable. What can you do after Easter? Every turn of the tire is a still point on the freeway. If you stand in one and notice what is around you, it is a pileup of the permanent. The churn of creation is a constant upward and downward action, simultaneous, eternal. If you keep thinking there is only an ahead and a behind, you are missing the side to side, which give evidence to the lie that you are moving progressively. If everything is moving at the same time, nothing is moving at all. Time is more like a failed resurrection than a measure of passage. That's, I think, poignant for anyone who's ever been stuck in traffic, especially someone who has to do it regularly. Here's the second section. The drive from the I-5 along Melrose to Sycamore, the drive up La Brea to Franklin, and right, then left up to Mulholland, the drive along Santa Monica to the rise up to the right and Sunset, the drive along Sunset east past the billboard of the man on a saddle, the drive from the 405 up onto La Cienega and the view of the hills, the difference between nirvana and nihil. In Catholic, despite the spiritual struggles she describes, Howe is engaging in apologetics. Part of her profession of faith involves declaring her love for St. Thomas Aquinas. This is Howe again. He was concerned with being, not doing, and his love for the world was so intense it infused his thought with compassion for all things. He has been compared to Confucius, Shankara, phenomenology. He makes it possible for some people now to remain Catholic, despite enormous misgivings and a consciousness of the church's bad acts. He's not the only one who makes it possible, but he is an important one because he is still considered an angelic doctor of the church, one whose thought remains foundational in Catholicism. You can find his mind there, waiting, permitting, guiding right into modern-day life. He saw each person as an important piece of a magnificent puzzle made by and for God. So, to whom is Howe apologizing in Catholic? In part, she's providing a means for her readers, many of whom, belonging to secularized, poetic, and academic circles, are baffled by her Catholicism, to understand her faith. She's giving them an opportunity to do that. Yes, she admits the church is responsible for unpleasant and even grievously wrong acts, and it's impossible not to be conscious of these acts, even while remaining Catholic. And yet, even as it's possible to believe that the apology is offered to unbelieving readers of contemporary poetry, it is just as likely, and perhaps more important creatively, that she is directing this apology to herself. In another essay, in The Wedding Dress, Howe wonders, but what will happen to language now that the word God has fizzled into the existential absurd, so that past and present are buried in instant parries and thrusts from the emptiness ahead? In Catholic, Howe seeks an answer to the emptiness of the absurd, to the existential absence she finds abiding in the word God. That answer arrives mysteriously but repeatedly for Howe in the form of the Eucharist, a vision with which she concludes Catholic. As she struggles with the daily process of soul erasure, as she makes her way in the world, buying material, selling her time, existing in the temporary infinity of her dreadful commute, Howe summons a virtue in paying attention to suffering and its redemption, in communal recognition, something the Mass ritualizes in the sacrament of the Eucharist. Everybody is invited to the table, or so she takes heart. I take this concluding passage to be the flaming, sacred core of Howe's faith, a genuinely moving and sincere glimpse of paradise. She writes, "This is why I keep moving and only stop for the Eucharist in a church where there are sick, vomiting, maimed, screaming, destroyed, violent, useless, happy, pious, fraudulent, hypocritical, lying, thieving, hating, drunk, rich, poverty-stricken people." In one of her interviews, Howe confessed that she felt the taking of the Eucharist was like eating beauty. So now, Joseph Donahue and Pam Reem. I'm doing them together, as you'll see. Joseph Donahue and Pam Reem are two contemporary American poets. Donahue was born in 1954 in Dallas, where he spent his early childhood before moving to Worcester, Massachusetts, back to the family's ancestral home following the assassination of John F. Kennedy, when Dallas began to feel like it wasn't such a good place to be Catholic. That's what he says in one of his poems. Since then, he's lived in New York City, Seattle, and Durham, North Carolina, among other places. And Reem was born in 1967 in rural Pennsylvania. She lives in Manhattan at present. I feel like I should confess this before going on, which is that Reem is Pam, as I call her, is the godmother to one of our kids. So there's a personal connection. It's like having a fairy godmother, sort of spirit witch, who lives in Manhattan and sends peculiar little packages to our son. So Donahue, of course, comes from a Catholic family, Reem from a Protestant family. I treat their work together in the final chapter of my book entitled Apocalypticism, A Way Forward in Poetry. The apocalypse I'm envisioning was foretold in an incendiary editorial authored by Lou Daly, who is Reem's husband, Alan Gilbert, Kristen Prevelet, and Reem herself in the inaugural issue of Apex of the M from spring 1994. And I brought the copy of the journal here if you're curious to look at it. And this is the journal they edited from Buffalo, where they were all associated with the poetics program at SUNY Buffalo. Reem alone was not enrolled as a student at the time. Actually, she never was a student there. It's because Daly was in the program. Donahue had some of his poetry published in the second issue of this journal. That's part of the connection here. Apex of the M was an unusual and spirited journal to have emerged from Buffalo in the early 1990s, which was best known as one of the primary stations of then emergent academic language poetry, led by Charles Bernstein, who was teaching there at the time. In contrast to the prevailing Marxist ideology and notions of the fragmentation of language and subject in the time of late capitalism that one attributes to language poetry, the editors of Apex of the M wanted conspicuously to connect their enterprise to notions of the spirit, claiming in the provocative editorial, of primary importance in this shift to move away from the current state of the art is a commitment to heterogeneity and alterity, to the unknown and the unspeakable as material influx leading to love. Defiantly romantic in tenor, the editors excoriated mainstream workshop poetry as deplorable, while insisting that avant-garde poets, in giving priority to language itself, had committed themselves emptily to the conventions of innovation, leading, quoting again from the editorial, leading to the socially inept dead end of autonomous forms. Why then should we not resist equally, asked the editors, both the suburban vacuity of mainstream poetics in verse and the avant-garde's poetics of language itself, with its force field-like purgation of radical alterity and non-linguistic material influx and receptivity from what we heed and write? Instead of these, the editors called for a radical transparency of language that would resist solipsism or the incorporation of the other into the problem of the poem, instead seeking a poetry of the conscious ear, one of Emily Dickinson's definitions of spirit. The editorial concludes with this claim. It's a doozy. Only in direct proportion to the way in which speaking disarms us making us irreplaceable on the path of an urgency by which we must, each in our way, remain overcome, will the faint strains of an apocalypse of utterance guide all hierarchy and mediacy into place, overwhelmed by a spiritual force, rendering them powerless against a destruction more irreversible than any fall, in the future of a suffusion almost immediately indistinguishable from peace. I love that. I'm just going to confess. And I think that's pure Lou Daly. That's my understanding. One of the four editorial writers. So I see both Donahue and Reem as apocalyptic poets. How then to characterize the difference in their poetry? In his work on the historical Jesus, John Dominic Crossan distinguishes between apocalyptic eschatology and sapiential eschatology, both to be found in the New Testament. Apocalyptic eschatology, quoting Crossan, announces the apocalypse of imminent and cataclysmic divine intervention to restore peace and justice to a disordered world. Sapiential eschatology emphasizes sapientia, wisdom, of knowing how to live here and now today so that God's present power is forcibly evident to all. Apocalyptic eschatology is world negation, stressing imminent divine intervention. We wait for God to act. Sapiential eschatology is world negation, emphasizing immediate divine imitation. God waits for us to act. The former is the message of John the Baptist, the latter that of Jesus. In my sense, Donahue's poetic eschatology is apocalyptic. Reem's is sapiential. For the last 20 years or more, Donahue has been writing an epic serial poem entitled Terra Lucida. The title means earth of light or land of light. Henry Corbin uses the name Terra Lucida in a few instances. Donahue is likeliest to have gotten his title from Corbin's book, The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, where Corbin, speaking of the mundus imaginalis, which is an intermediary realm in which the worldly self confronts its angelic self, a concrete world of archetype figures, apparitional forms, angels of species and of individuals. That's Corbin. And in the same piece, Corbin declares that in Manichaeism, there is in the earth of light, Terra Lucida, situated in the kingdom of light. It is governed by a divinity of eternal light, surrounded by 12 splendors. So Donahue's Terra Lucida is a realm of memory, intuition, vision, and sacred knowledge keyed to experience and expressed with uncanny lyric gifts. So consider this hierophany from Terra Lucida, framed by doubts and meditations on doubt on the one side and a description of early Christian heresy on the other. The early Christian heresy he's talking about is Docetism. Writes Donahue, a mortal is about to see the majesty of the throne, though in the stream of clouds it may be only the foot of the throne, or a snarl of white mist in the field in the first of the sunlight. Nonetheless, an heretical beauty floods the ranks of the world. The black still pours down, but the peaks break free. Branches aglow with a wet flame, sky a deep violet surges behind the charcoal mountain where the rain is still falling on a single gorge of brightness after the sudden storm of the first night of my death. Angelic tormentors are silent. The archive of what is stands open. While in the ruins of an orchard with its stretch of tree stumps like the broken guards of a once sublime palace, birds lie quietly on the grass. Nonetheless, a heretical beauty floods the ranks of the world. An interesting pun whiffs from ranks. Donahue is invoking the ranks of the angelic hierarchy imagined by Dionysius and Rilke, just as he is alluding to the rank and file of the world below. But isn't there a smell here? The rank odor of the human world below, which, despite its stench, streams with a beauty from the light emanating from God's eternal throne? If one thing characterizes the active imagination Donahue brings to bear on his poem, it's his desire that the visionary reality he has entered not be merely some dream, but a place of absolute reality. His skill at conveying this feeling seems unmatched by any other contemporary American poet, such that parts of his poem exhibit a simultaneous lightness of touch and gravitational pull, where surrealistic follies vie with imaginal intensities. Here's one of the best examples, in my mind, of Donahue's mastery. One heaven for optics, one for mysticism, and down the hall, idling. On a stage, a string quartet. A hawk shakes the trees as the sun falls over these houses, over these hills, where, since this is California, a father tells his son, there are two kinds of infinities, those that can be counted and those that cannot. And later, at bedtime, his mother will add, and there are those crossed by souls, once they have drunk from white cups of magnolia blossom over a sunlit deck, in a forest where festive guests toast the abracadabra of zero, as at a low-limbed tree where a path meets the stream, the ghost of two girls wait in the shade for a passerby purer than you, from whom to slice the heart and read in its red the whim of the stars. I'm drowsy, but I don't want to sleep, one girl says to the other. I don't want our marvelous death to be only a dream. The abracadabra of zero. It's that quality of inevitability Donahue manages in these lines, the expression of death as marvelous, and the sense that the heart has in it the whim of the stars that both ventilates and intensifies the apocalypse we get glimpses from in his poetry. Reem is a poet more modest than Donahue, both in terms of her output, which is consistent but on a smaller scale than Donahue's. She writes short lyric poems and has no aspirations toward the epic, and in terms of the work itself, in which modesty is clearly a virtue. A roof is no guarantee that you'll sleep. The unease of premises pins together the curtains at night, waiting for a clearness of purpose. Eating 3 meals a day, we go to bed hungry. Privacy is not a remedy. We've become separated by efficiencies. Nobody can do anything with a kind of machine person floundering in the dark. It's hard to believe 5 sparrows were sold for this. Reem's poem hinges on a claim whose critique stems from perception. Here, the sense that our lives are filled with things that make it easier but worse. Reem works in her poems through aphorisms. A roof is no guarantee that you'll sleep, but one she modulates with a resigned disdain that verges on despair. It's hard to believe 5 sparrows were sold for this. This poem, writes Reem, is about the frustration of living in a culture that separates humans from the natural world. It's a poem that wonders what it means to live among things that I wouldn't consider to be essential to living. The sparrows, she continues, are a reference to Luke 12:6. Reem's principal tool of revelation in her poetry is the anagram. Typically, she identifies a word with some significance to her poem, from out of which she seeks hidden meanings and associations. Certainly, there's a playfulness to her rearrangements of the letters in a word, but there's also a gravity she seems to locate, connecting her practice for me to the exercise of notaricon, the practice in ecstatic Kabbalah of rearranging the letters in the name of God, or in other things, to uplift one's praying mind to a transcendent realm of meaning. Behold, a wilderness of voices crying within one. Pursuit, the tension created between proof and devotion. When reveal becomes a lever and you press it, your heart will feel gallantly recreated. In a sense, the exhortation to behold in these lines prompts the poet and reader to look to see that there is a lever hidden in the letters of reveal. Reem's poem Eden might be read as an ars poetica for her anagrammatic technique, as well as a demonstration of her skills with this method. Endure has an end. You may rue at the outset, but it also has need, and need is an Eden, if you know what I mean. Eden equals need. One and the same. How I hold it. Endure is one of those words of power in Reem's body of work. It locates her feelings of frustration with the world of getting and spending she tolerates and suffers in, but it also suggests the ability to bear something difficult outbreaking, the definition of virtue in Reem's poetry. But even endurance has an end, one manifested in need. The hinge of this poem is the ironic intensity of her declaration and discovery that need is an Eden, underscored by the parenthetical aside, which we can read as something said under the breath and meant to be funny, or more likely as something deadly serious. Do we really know what she means? Probably not. To reinforce her point, she makes plain the equation, Eden equals need, which then allows her to finish the poem with a repetition, the same, and an assertion, how I hold it, calling the whole poem into momentary question, in that it sounds suddenly as resolved as it does desperate. The mysterious word in Eden is rue, of course. In this poem, it's the residue of letters, sounds left behind after end has been extracted from endure. Ruefulness is sorrow, regret, and grief, an unusual feeling to drive one's work. Reem uses rueful feelings in her poetry the way the fathers of the early Christian church elaborated the concept of penthos. St. Gregory of Nyssa writes, "Penthos, in general, is a sorrowful disposition of the soul caused by the privation of something desirable." Irenee Househair explains that there is one word that expresses all that is desirable, salvation. Here, then, is the first concept of penthos, mourning for lost salvation, whether one's own or that of others. Rue, mourning for lost salvation, is what we get when the need for Eden is extracted from the word endure. I'd like to conclude this talk by invoking William James, whose specter in many ways hovered over me as I conducted this work. In the conclusions to the varieties of religious experience, having presented extensive case studies that validate the pathological and mystical aspects of his subject, but in a moment of exultant resignation, James confesses, "The whole drift of my education goes to persuade me that the world of our present consciousness is only one out of many worlds of consciousness that exist, and that those other worlds must contain experiences which have a meaning for our life also, and that although in the main their experience and those of this world keep discrete, yet the two become continuous at certain points, and higher energies filter in." Religious poetry filters the higher energies in. As readers, we seek these energies, drawing power from what this poetry releases into us. No matter what the age declares of itself, no matter how absent of spiritual truth and tendency you operate, there is beneath the loquacious level of your rationalism, and there is beneath the loquacious level that your rationalism inhabits, a deeper level to your nature where intuitions and occult convolutions gather, and where, even deeper, a darkness emanates the material of creation. It's poetry that narrates and demonstrates that dark energy, an unconsuming fire in which our imaginations come most intensely to life. Thank you very much. That's a really good question. And instinctively, I think it comes in part from some of the poets that he was working with at the time, for whom minimalism that was not necessarily always syntactical was acceptable. I'm thinking in part, Zhukovsky wasn't really a minimalist, but he definitely was very comfortable with asyntactical poetry. So I think he took a lot of heart from that. But I also think, and now I'm kind of reading what I know about his biography into his work, but, Samperi was, I think he was poor, really poor almost all of his life, and he was mentally troubled. So he was receiving, he basically was on Social Security benefits for his disability. And I think he spent a great deal of time alone. And he did a lot of walking, and I think he was up at night walking around Brooklyn where he lived and walking through the parks. And I feel like these anchoring religious texts provided a sort of gateway of, if not quite salvation, a feeling of connection. And I think he read them very closely and repeatedly. And as a result, that language started to, I think the words took on presence form. So they come to us, and especially hearing it for the first time, probably sounded really abstract. But I think for him, these were very particular. And the longer poem that I read, it really consists almost entirely of single words lined up on the page. And in fact, I think the size of these books was determined by how long those lists are. And sometimes they have a phrase in them. Sometimes there's a little lyrical flourish. And he could also be marvelously, straightforwardly lyrical. But in these theologically dense poems, that's when he becomes the least syntactic, and that's the part of his work I find most exciting. And I think it's because it seems really, there's just a lot of voltage there, which is weird for a lyric poet because he really isn't using a lot of pronouns. He's not using any I, thou constructions or we constructions, although they do come around. He's finding a way to give lyric voltage to these abstract words, pilgrimage, image, eternity. Like that's the last line of that particular poem. And it has a little bit of the concrete element there because you see the image, but that's my instinct. He is a poet very much approachable, I think, initially, if abstract, but who repeated reading rewards. He gets better and better. And in fact, the initial version of this essay that I wrote some years ago was much more critical of his work. And when I was revising things for the book, I felt it really imperative to reassess his work significantly upwards. I mean, I think I didn't give him enough credit, especially in terms of what I was saying in part about him. It's not a poetry of creation. It's not like Blake, where it's just this, you feel the imagination coming to life. It's a poetry of reflection, and that initially doesn't seem as exciting. But I think he finds some really exciting things in the work. The best of it is that trilogy. He wrote some other stuff, but none of it's as good. I don't know if he kind of lost the zazz or had to build up to the zazz, but that's the zazziest, the trilogy. I came from another thing, but maybe kind of a shared source, which was a famous essay that Ezra Pound edited / wrote from notes that were assembled by a sinologist named Ernest Fenollosa called The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry. Wow. So that essay contains these little, prophetic power loads, and I was able to take elements of that and kind of devise this idea for the poem from that. Yeah, that's another lecture or reading, more of a reading. But yeah, it comes from a similar source, which is I think that modernism, the discovery of the image was the thing. And so Samperi was very much writing in that mode, but for him the image took on an abstract quality. It took on the quality of abstraction, which, now we're used to. Abstract art, most of us are pretty comfortable with it. So.
Did he have the exposure to Chinese poetry?
Samperi?
Yeah.
He did through Sid Corman, who was his mentor, correspondent, and editor. Corman was an American poet who relocated to Kyoto in the 1960s, where he lived, I think, almost for 50 years, for a very long time. Definitely. And those books were printed in Japan. Yeah, definitely.
Physical, right?
Yeah. And that to me, that was one of the things that really drew me to those books. Like, they're so beautiful. The work can't just be crap. That was my thought. And that's been true. The ones that I was reading? Yes, definitely. Yeah, so Sam Perry, I think if he hadn't been associated with this Sid Corman and then some of these second generation objectivist poets, I expect he would have been completely forgotten. So as a result of, and those poets they don't have any religious sort of quality. It doesn't characterize the work significantly. But Corman saw something in Sam Perry's work and championed it and essentially enabled these books to come into print. So as a result, I think we have the work, but I don't know that they particularly knew how to approach that aspect of his work. And the chapter on Sam Perry comes from an essay that I wrote, and it was the first ever essay that had ever been written about Sam Perry's work that had been published, and that was in the early aughts. So he had already been dead for over a decade at that point. I don't think anybody was paying attention to his work. There's a small group of devoted readers of his stuff, but again, fairly small. The case with Fanny Howe is more public and more interesting because she has been, until really her literary star started to ascend, she was primarily associated with American experimental poetry and writing, and in particular peripherally with the language poets. And there are many useful things that can be said about language poetry and the language poets, and there are some maybe useless things that can be said, and I've probably said a few of them. But I will say that I don't think it's hyperbole to say there is not a religious bone in any of their bodies. They are antipathetic to religion in terms of the way that the movement and those who kind of gatekeep the movement present it. So I suspect that her religious material was baffling, if not tolerated to a degree. When she started to become more visible, publishing with a slightly more mainstream poetry press, Grey Wolf, and her books gained some traction, and she herself started to be represented, or started to present herself as a kind of a religious poet. She took some hits. She took some early hits, including in Poetry Magazine, which eventually gave her one of its most prestigious awards. They gave her the Ruth Lilly Lifetime Achievement Award. But prior to that, there was a review of I want to say her book. It might be Gone. In any case, there was a review of one of her then recent books in poetry, and she was just demolished. And the demolition on the part of the reviewer, whose name is Brian Phillips, it essentially accused her of being a fraud spiritually. He accused her of spiritual fraudulence, and not because he was like a radical avant-gardian. I think he was kind of a mainstream figure, but he presumed that her professions of religious faith were insincere, and that was his criticism of the poet. He didn't actually address the quality of the poetry at all. He's just like, she puts off, the phrase is soft clouds of profundity in her work. It's a reviewerese for a kind of statement. So that's an example. Donahue and Reem are both obscure poets, and I believe the religious quality of their work, including its content, contributes to their obscurity. Or to that obscurity. Nevertheless, those who are fans of Donahue's work, and they do exist, are fairly rapt about the mystical Corbinian, Twilight of the Idols stuff. It seems to be, people really dig it. In Reem's case, it's in a sense more pointed. She has a small audience for sure, but one of her publishers published a chapbook of hers, who happens also to be my publisher, a guy named Zach Barocas, who's he's a punk rock drummer. That was his thing before he started publishing poetry. He said, yeah, Reem's books of poetry are like the Velvet Underground's first album. It's like, so Brian Eno famously said, first Velvet Underground's album sold only 40,000 copies, but every person who listened to it started a band. And the people who read Reem, they all become poets because of her work. That's a hyperbolic claim, but that's the way she's regarded, with great reverence. When you find people who like her work, they love it, and that's an aspect of it they love. Its spiritual elements, I don't think that they're particularly... I think I'm one of the first people to address that as well. But she's also my exact contemporary, so, hopefully that will come. So Eliot is one of the anchors of the book, and so I talk about his work, talk about modernism maybe a little more generally, but I specify Eliot's work and H.D.'s work as providing a kind of the religious anchors, so to speak, or at least the models. In Eliot's case, I spend less time talking about the four quartets, not because I didn't want to, but as many of you are likely aware, it's exorbitantly expensive to quote from that poem in even a university press book. It would have, and those burdens have shifted to the authors, and unless you have the access to a honeypot, you're going to pay that stuff yourself. And four quartets is not in the public domain yet, so it was really just too expensive for me to quote from. So I adjusted my argument more toward The Wasteland, which is in the public domain, and therefore you can quote freely from it. What you could do actually is go type out the poem, Xerox it, and then sell it for $3 a copy if you wanted, and you wouldn't be breaking any laws. But if you did that with four quartets, I feel like the Eliot estate would bring the hammer down. I think they have watchful eyes everywhere. So, but The Wasteland served my purpose in essence as well as the four quartets would, which is I describe The Wasteland as the most avant-garde and apocalyptic poem of the modernist era, and I don't think that those two mosts are incompatible. I think that they reinforce each other. I think the apocalypticism enabled the avant-gardism, and likewise the avant-gardism made the apocalypticism have so much more traction. In H.D.'s case, and I talk about them together, with H.D.'s poetry, it's more decidedly esoteric. She's quite apocalyptic, but the esoteric element, I think, is the thing that has really flowed into the poets that I'm addressing. And so to get to the second part of your question, or the Rethke question, I don't talk about him at all in the book. And I locate not by any sort of, not for any sort of aesthetic prejudice. I locate my discussions with poets that are more or less in this modernist, new American, you might call experimental lineage. So not because I don't have interest in Rethke and other poets from that generation. Robert Lowell is an obvious poet to have written about in the context of this book, but I just didn't. There's a lot written about Lowell. There's not a lot written about Sam Perry. So that seemed like, for me, a useful trade-off. But I easily could. And there are a lot of poets that I think, One poet I wish I had written about or included in this is the poet Robert Lax. I don't know if you're familiar with his work at all. He and Thomas Merton went to Columbia together. They both converted to Catholicism at the same time. Merton went on to become the most famous monk of the 20th century. Lax went on to total obscurity, living on the island of Patmos, where he wrote these incredible minimalist poems that go on for 150 pages, but take about 15 minutes to read. Right? That's a good epic. Some of us would feel he could easily have occupied at least a chapter or a place in the book, maybe part 2. That's an excellent question, and in fact, we were talking about this beforehand. Maybe some of those higher energies will filter into the podcast after it's edited. So I think the poets that I look at in the book can be placed into 3 groups. So one are poets who themselves are believers and in whose work there is some either rehearsal or reflection of that belief. So Sam Perry I place in that category, Fanny Howe I place in that category. And then the second category consists of poets in whose work elements traditionally associated with religious thought or religious phenomena are played with, manifested, recognized. And for those poets, while I would say all of them come from religious backgrounds, I don't know that they would ever describe themselves as believers. And that would include Robert Duncan, who gets 2 chapters in the book, Nathaniel Mackey, a poet closely associated with Duncan. It would describe the work of Lissa Wolzak. She is a poet who was born in the United States but has lived in Vancouver for most of her adult life, and so she tends to be associated with that. Oh, in the first category, you could also put Geoffrey Hill. I read about Geoffrey Hill, and I would put him in that first category I described. And then there are poets who essentially are in between. They're poets that maybe come from a religious background that they may have either moved away from, turned their back on, or something else, but in whose work there is this rehearsal of religious characteristics or phenomena. I think Joe Donahue and Pam Reem would fall into that category, and I feel like I'm forgetting somebody in my list. In any case, that's something I was definitely mindful of. Oh, Robinson Jeffers. He would be somebody I'd place in that middle category. I read about him as well. So I don't know that necessarily answers your question, but it's definitely something I was thinking about. And in the book, to give an example of the second category, which I think is a really powerful one in American poetry, and poetry more generally, I talk about the life and work briefly of Paul Celan, who's a poet, somewhat obscure even to German readers. He wrote poetry in German, but he's had an unusually vibrant life. He's a very difficult poet. For a poet who writes at with such consistent difficulty, he's had an unusually vibrant life in especially American experimental poetry. And I can think of 2 or 3 contemporary American poets whose moves are taken from Celan's poetry, who themselves probably would never think of what they're doing as religious. And Celan himself, I don't think that he professed any religious belief, but his poetry is approached as if it's liturgical by many readers, and it has this the language play involves a lot of mysticism, mystical manipulation of language, and a lot of what I think of as theological invention. He's coming up with new words, new ways of conceptualizing things, particularly in his later work. So Samperi, Howe, and Donahue, I place them in that category. Wolzak was raised as a Catholic, and there are certain her mysticism is maybe a little more generalized, but you could probably also connect her with this as well. I mean, Samperi's work is saturated with Catholic theology. That's clearly one of his inspirational sources. So if that doesn't make you Catholic, I don't know what does. He's just this is how he reads life and creation. In Donahue's case, it's a little more subtle, but maybe something that some here can relate to, which is that Donahue he's from this Irish Catholic family from Massachusetts, and they were in Dallas because his dad had a job down there. And as he describes in, I think, his greatest book, which is called Dark Church, there's a section of that book called Dallas. He describes that, shortly after he was born, his mother basically started to have a nervous breakdown while she was there. And for all sorts of reasons, presumably. But I suspect this says something about her wherewithal and her character. She regarded what was happening to her as a religious experience. She didn't read it as pathological, or at least psychologically pathological. She was like, something's happening to me, and I need to figure out what that is. So I think Donahue's his early life was saturated with the sort of reality of his Catholicism. His mom would go to their parish, which was nearby, and sit for hours, staring at the monstrance, because something was happening to her, and she was looking at that, solar symbol. And then Donahue himself, she paid him a penny for each stroke when she would have him brush her hair. So each of those strokes, she would pay him a penny. And he's got these descriptions of being with her and brushing her hair. He refers to this river of light that he was just brushing from her. So she took on this kind of mystical maternal property for him as well. And even though I don't know that he would even identify himself today as Catholic, I mean, there's no question. Like, this guy is, he could be one of my uncles. Like this, it's just like, I just know I know all of everything about the cultural milieu he comes from. Even though he's from Dallas/Massachusetts, I'm from Detroit. It's just like, we'll both be having the potatoes. So I think that some of that might actually just be could we call it cultural residue, Catholic or otherwise? And I don't want to set anything up where it seems like there are exclusive religious parameters or guidelines that they're drawing. They're not. And especially, Donahue's work is small c Catholic. He's really drawing from as many sources as he can to keep it going. He's on a Mayan kick right now. It's like, it's all coming from the Maya. Yeah, so you never know where it's going to come from, but when it comes, you obey, as a poet at least. Yeah, that's a good question. Let's just say yes. Yeah, there is room for suspicion, but there's no room at my inn for it, if you get my drift. No, that's I'm being glib. But before I answer that excellent question, I wanted to say, very early in this project, when I was beginning to formulate its elements and trying to discern what exactly it is that I was thinking about or doing, I had introduced a poetry reading at the Harold Washington Library as part of the Chicago Poetry Project, and Jeremy he attended that reading. I think it was the Nathaniel Mackey, Ed Roberson reading, and I was talking about religious experience and stuff like that. I was pressing Jeremy's buttons, and yes, and he wrote me a lengthy email afterwards, interrogating pretty much everything I had said, and that ended up being incredibly helpful at that incipient stage, because it allowed me to start to frame what I might or might not be doing with this particular project. So that's a belated thank you. And I'm always glad to get questions from Jeremy. So I take your question to be something about the relationship between my own faith life and what I'm doing either as critic or poet. There's no separation between my faith life and my creative life. They are coterminous. I can't separate them, and all the confusions of one filter into the other, and the solutions of one resolve in the other as well. And some of the greatest, most meaningful experiences in my creative life have been related to religious experience, poetic experience, and the combination thereof. The question of the critic stuff is more complicated. So, like Jeremy, this is where I did my work. I took classes in this room, and I've always been an enthusiast. That's how I approach things, and that presented problems from the standpoint of doctoral work. I was not especially. I wasn't sufficiently skeptical. Let's say that. What was you didn't use the word skeptical. You used.
I think I used the word suspicious.
Suspicious.
Hermeneutics is
Yeah.
suspicion is skeptical.
Yeah. Right. And I would say that was provided by my overseers, who did the best they could to hold the enthusiasm in check. I think they did a pretty good job. Actually, they did a really good job. I had the good fortune to have a deceased faculty member here, Mark Krupnick, as my dissertation advisor. Mark knew and appreciated the poetry I was writing about, specifically Robert Duncan and his poetry, and he wasn't daunted by my hyperbolic claims about that work, but he also wanted to make sure that I placed it in a proper scholarly critical context. From there, I would say my desire to conform to critical orthopraxy has steadily diminished. I don't feel that that's the contribution that I need to make. And as a result, in this book, or I guess this book, Joseph is looking at it, he's poring over it. Look how absorbed he is. That's, there's critical perspective on all of these poets, in particular Robert Duncan, whom I've, written about very enthusiastically. The 2 chapters on Duncan's work, I really am trying to put some of his moves in perspective. In particular, his monomania. But I see my work as a work of advocacy. these are poets worth reading, and I hope I can persuade you why, what can be found there. And at this point, I don't see any advantage to changing that. I continue to, writing essays and criticism remains really important to me, so I don't think I'll stop doing it, but I'm more interested in, I want to move closer to, as close as I can to the modes, the critical modes of the poets whose work I most admire. And, I'm thinking of, Eliot has this amazing monograph on Dante. I love that. Here's how to read Dante. Here's what it's like. Robert Duncan's Truth and Life of Myth, his essay and essential autobiography. Things like Emerson's The Poet. I want to go there. That's the direction I want to go. Will anybody read it? Probably not.
What's Duncan's monomania?
What is it? Well, it's the thing that the poet Philip Whalen called his awful autonomous I. I as in the pronoun. Just that he was intolerant of anybody's slightly wobbled or varied idea of what poetry is from his, and he was ferocious on the attack. And he did this repeatedly. I think of Duncan in relation to something that Freud famously quipped, which is, I need two people in my life, a friend and an enemy. And Duncan operated on with the same valence. It was just like, I just need someone that I can thrash apart and someone who's supporting me. I'm getting a signal, perhaps, that we may have come to the end of our time together. I'm grateful for all of you being here. Thank you very much. And maybe you have concluding words?
Just say let's think.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a bunch, everybody.